Good evening, everybody. My name is Cara McCarty, and I'm the Curatorial Director at the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight to the National Design Week 2007. It's wonderful to have such a great turnout. In addition to everyone here, I understand that there are a number of people who are tuning in online across the country. So on behalf of us here, I'd like to extend a great welcome to all of you. National Design Week and the National Design Awards are the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum's most important outreach efforts to expand the public's awareness about the important role design can play in our life. On behalf of all of us, I'd like to extend our sincerest gratitude to Target. For none of this week's events would have been possible without the extraordinary and ongoing generosity of Target. Because of their generosity, we are able to offer the National Design Awards and a series of free events, as well as free admission to the museum every day this week. Yesterday, this hall was completely transformed. It looked completely different. It was abuzz with over 400 teenagers from as far away as Kansas City who came to attend our Teen Design Fair. They were able to discuss their futures and their dreams with some of our best-known designers from all fields, including Tim Gunn, Isaac Mizrahi, Cynthia Rowley, and Jacob Trollback. I wish maybe next year it would be possible I could have a video playing of what it looked like, because it was just so much wonderful, enthusiastic energy and optimism yesterday. Tomorrow, we are hosting a panel breakfast to discuss the impact of green design on business. The centerpiece of the week is Thursday night's National Design Awards Gala. And we'll end the week on Friday with an open house for over 200 New York teachers. Today, we are living in an unprecedented time of unprecedented public awareness and participation in the design process. In addition to hosting events in the museum, we are reaching online to design enthusiasts across the country. Over 200 organizations in all 50 states are offering their own Design Week events. We've launched our Educator Resource Center with lesson plans aligned to national standards and other resources to help teachers integrate design into their curricula. And finally, we have a forum for the public to nominate their own favorite designs through the People's Design Award. There are over 300 nominations. The voting will close at 11 p.m. tonight, so we'll let you out in time to go home. And the top nominees are neck and neck. So if you are passionate about a design, your vote can help determine the outcome. The results of the People's Design Award, as well as the entire awards ceremony, will be webcast live on Thursday night at www.cooperhewitt.org. This evening, we are delighted to have with us some of the winners of the 2007 National Design Awards. They have given generously of their time to come talk with us about what it means to be a designer today. Now I'd like to introduce them to you briefly before they come up to the stage for discussion that will hopefully enlighten all of us. And that is going to be a participatory session. Before I get started, I'd just like to note that Chip Kidd was not able to attend tonight, and he asked us to send you his regrets. The first firm I'd like to tell you about is LTL. It's an innovative, award-winning New York City-based architecture and design partnership founded by Paul Lewis, David Tsurumaki, and Paul Lewis in 1997. They've produced a diverse range of work from private residences to affordable housing, to cultural buildings, to commercial projects. It's a collaborative studio. All three architects are deeply involved in each project from inception to completion. They're noted for their innovative and imaginative solutions. Their hands-on engagement can be seen in the results of the following 3 projects. And here we see the Lozu restaurant. All are award-winning restaurants in New York City. And they're like installations. They are nuggets. They provide us insight into the way these architects work and their sensitivity to and experiments with materials. They work with small budgets, often awkward, restricted spaces, which give the opportunity to test their creative spirit and experiments with materials. This is the Xing restaurant, a Pan-Asian restaurant composed of 4 distinct areas, each defined by a different material: bamboo, stone, velvet, and here you can see acrylic, that runs a long corridor into the dining room and extends as a light canopy above the dining area, and then miraculously drops down into a bar. This is Fluff Bakery, a bakery and coffee shop that uses stacked felt and plywood to wrap the interior and support a bent steel chandelier. They also design large-scale institutional buildings, and this is Bornhuder Hall at the College of Worcester, Ohio. It's a dormitory with 2 wings and an outdoor courtyard, and above the courtyard, cantilevered above, are small sort of nests that are part of these work-study nooks. They're placemaking spaces, contrast to some of the larger public areas in the dormitory. LTL's work has been exhibited in Cooper-Hewitt's 2000 triennial and was one of 6 firms in the United States Pavilion of the 2004 Venice Architecture Biennial. In addition to their architecture practice, they have all authored several books and are all dedicated educators. Paul at Princeton, David at Parsons, and Marc at Columbia. Tonight, they'll be represented by Marc and David. Office Da is a Boston-based architecture and design firm established by principal partners Monica Ponce de Leon and Nader Tehrani. They're distinguished by their interdisciplinary approach to architecture and their innovative construction techniques. They work nationally and internationally. Their projects range from affordable housing to buildings for academic and cultural institutions. Adding on or making an intervention to a historic building is always a challenge. And here at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, they were asked to convert the hall of a 1917 Fleet Banking Hall into a new main library for the students and faculty. It consists of 2 pavilions at either end of the hall, surrounding little study pavilions, a reading room, and a circulation pavilion. It's conceived as a colossal living room and adds intimacy to the student dormitories that are housed above the library. This architectural intervention into an historic structure maintains its historic integrity while also suggesting a contemporary solution. They've also worked internationally, and their work is distinguished by an intense experimental interest in materials and the details by which they join. This is the Dongshan Gate House, built in Beijing, and epitomizes the physical aspects of their work: textures, shapes, materials, and the wonderful connections. Who would think that this is a gas station if you hadn't seen the cars and the gas pumps? It was recently opened in Los Angeles. It's by BP, called the Helios House. A very imaginative solution. Begins with a column, and the whole design is based around the animation of a column, clad in faceted stainless steel panels. And it's all about sustainability, greening the site, reducing light, recycling, green materials, green roof. I hope this is something that Nader will have an opportunity to talk to us about tonight. And lastly, this is their most recent project, the McCollum Building in South Boston, a big brown sloping shape. I saw it a few weeks ago overlooking a very industrial site and railroad tracks. It's a wonderful imaginative solution. The high end overlooks the railroad, giving the residents a great view of Boston, and at the other end, sloping down to a much more pedestrian-sized scale. It houses 150 condominium units and is the first LEED certified environmentally sensitive multi-housing building in Boston and is apt to receive the LEED Gold standard. And LEED means Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Rick Owens, who I understand is in the United States for the first time in 5 years. Was born and raised in Southern California and studied at Parsons in Los Angeles. He studied pattern making and spent a number of years cutting patterns for sportswear companies before embarking on his own label. In 2003, he moved to Paris, where he oversees his own line and served as artistic director for the French fur company Revillon, which he has very successfully revived. He has a strong reputation and following and is a favorite of celebrities and a number of rock stars. Here we see one of his more restrained designs, a silk coat designed for Revillon. It represents his chic, crisp, asymmetrical designs and epitomizes modern elegance. It's a contemporary sensibility, but at the same time gives us a quality of the workmanship associated with haute couture. This is one of my absolute favorite designs of his that I've seen. It's a leather jacket and cotton pants, and it exemplifies the edginess that characterizes much of his work. It's infused with a sense of drama and seductive sculptural lines that characterize much of Rick's work. The wishbone dress, which is a very appropriately named work, is made in his characteristic black palette, minimalist design, using the layers of silk jersey, silk, organza, and a leather crown. And it also exemplifies the draping for which he is well known. His leather jackets are worn by many celebrities and rock stars and hang in a number of women's wardrobes. This one is entitled Exploder. He says his clothes are not for the intimidated. People come to me for things that are a little poignant, a little broken. His works are known for the rough-hewn bias-cut shearlings, and the leather jackets often exemplifies glamour meeting grunge. Peter Walker is here from Peter Walker and Partners Landscape. It's an architecture firm based in Berkeley, California. Peter is a partner and brings more than 50 years of experience in the teaching and practice of landscape architecture. He's among the leading voices in the field. He's obsessed with the clarity and technical precision needed to establish positions of permanence in the design landscape. His commissions range from urban design and planning for public parks and university campuses to corporate headquarters, museum plazas, and private gardens. This first slide is of Tanner Fountain on the Harvard University campus. During a certain period of my life, I walked past it every day. And at the time, I didn't know it was by Peter, but it struck me because it was always my marker every day when I was going to where I was going. But it struck me a simple gesture like this with rocks activated by water, people, weather, or the seasons could have such an impact on people. It's about informal placemaking and site dynamics. The Toyota Municipal Art Museum is an example of his quiet interventions for which he's become so well known. Frequently, he uses sheets of water to reflect the sky. And throughout his work, flatness and nuanced gestures are apparent. Characteristic, subtle balance of landscape design and nature and mastery of construction summarizes Peter's work. This is the Nasher Sculpture Garden, which was built behind Renzo Piano's Nasher Sculpture Museum, which opened in 2003. Unlike the flatness and gestures in some of his earlier work, here the linear vertical gestures of the trees, the alleys of trees, hedges, and water help define the garden so it becomes a museum without a roof. And they provide platforms, showcases for the sculpture, which are the protagonists in this garden. But it also serves as a serene urban park. And this last slide is of Copia, the American Center for Wine, Food, and Art in Napa Valley. And again, giving texture to the landscape in a respectful, unobtrusive manner characterizes Peter's work. Recently, we know Peter Walker and architect Michael Arad for having been selected for the World Trade Center Memorial in New York. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite the panelists up to the stage. And before I get, hello? Hello? Before I get started, I would just like to extend a multitude of thanks to the staff at the Cooper-Hewitt Museum. I'm new here. I started just a couple months ago, but I have been struck day after day by the dedication of the staff here. People here work hours beyond their normal work schedule, tirelessly putting in hours, volunteering to make events like this happen. So I really want to thank them. It makes me very proud to be associated with an institution like this. And so thank you very much. Okay, this is meant to be an informal format. This is an event as much for you out there as much as for anyone. And so we will get started. I'll ask a few questions. I hope the panelists will ask a few questions of one another. And then at all times, anyone from the audience who has a question, please just signal. There are a few of the Cooper-Hewitt staff members in the aisles with microphones, so just let them know you have a question, and you can interrupt at any time. Rick, I'd like to start with you. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background, how and when you decided to become a fashion designer.
Well, I wanted to be an artist, and I didn't think...
Closer. A little closer.
Is this good? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, great.
To tell you the truth, becoming an artist seemed a little bit more of a commitment than I was willing to make. So I liked clothes and I wanted to make a living, so I went to pattern making school to learn how to make patterns so that I could always fall back on that. And after about 5 years of working for other companies, I decided to go on my own and be broke if need be, and I'm glad I'm not. And that kind of brings us to here.
I'm glad you're not either. Maybe that's... You're here, and what is it like to be an American in Paris? You grew up in Southern California, an American in Paris?
You know, it's going to be a long time before I feel completely at home there. I haven't learned how to speak French in the 5 years that I've been there. Luckily, there's enough people around me who speak English so I can get what I need done clearly. To tell you the truth, it's very pleasant to be a guest in Paris, and I think I'm going to hold on to that for as long as I can. It's nice to have a little sense of alienation in a foreign country. So, you know, I think I don't think I'm going to learn French too soon. So,
good, honest answer. Just one more question about about your background, having grown up in Southern California, because how is that impacting your designs, do you think?
I think there's something in American design that is very direct, very a straight line from A to B, or A to Z. I think that might appeal to Europeans. I like the directness and I like the frankness. I like the clarity of that kind of method of working. So does that kind of answer the question? I kind of meandered off.
Yeah, that's good. Very good. Thank you. David and Marc, I'll let you decide who's going to be answering the questions I hope you share, but maybe you can talk to me about collaboration, because I find it very interesting. The three of you formed a company in 1997, and two of you are brothers, and collaborate on projects. And does one dominate, or do you get along all the time, or?
The silence is probably
I was gonna
indicative
say,
of something
that answers a
more. No, we get along all the time and we never argue. No, it's actually the collaboration is absolutely essential to the way in which we set up the office, and we set it up very much with a kind of best idea wins philosophy, so that we really approach design of spaces by establishing a very clear set of questions. In other words, through issues of research, through investigation, that then enables the design to come out of the research that grounds the conditions for the discussion. So as opposed to framing it around personality, we try to frame it around the conditions of the project, which enables a collaboration to occur because you have a shared set of conditions to work with, as opposed to segregating each project depending on which partner is involved.
Yeah, and in that sense, our practice is probably quite different from many other multi-partner practices, where there's an expectation, I think, that there's, for instance, a business partner, a design partner, et cetera. Whereas our practice is really based on a kind of redundancy in the end, which is to say that all three partners are critically interested in the designs of each of the projects that comes through the office. And for us, the strength that comes from having three designers isn't simply being able to do more projects, but is actually a product of this kind of intense interaction that occurs on a day-to-day basis, which allows us to be critical of each other, which allows us to, I think, expand each other's ideas and, in a sense, kind of play off of our our own sort of strengths to develop designs which actually don't follow a kind of singular trajectory, but can be diverted, can be augmented, and can be, in a way, detoured by the impacts and the influences of the other partners.
And do you find that when you work together, you are falling into patterns of habits of working, or do you continue to find ways to challenge each other and sort of be sparring partners? And
our daily routine is sufficiently different, week in, week out, that it's very hard to fall into patterns. And the only thing that where we do find patterns, we try to be as self-conscious about them as possible, and recognize that if a pattern is developing and it's not answering the particulars of a project, in other words, it's referring back to a previous project or reiterating a known answer, that with the three of us there, we're able to effectively question and critique and open up the possibility of saying, this doesn't make sense, let's move in another direction.
The other thing that aids that, I think, is that we consciously choose projects in terms of the work in the office to be as different as possible from previous projects, if that's possible. So I think you showed several of the kind of restaurant projects that we've executed in the past few years, and I think we've been sort of self-consciously looking at the new work that we're doing now, not only in terms of the dimension that David's speaking about, which is, I think, critically paying attention to a kind of a desire to not repeat solutions because they come easily, but also to confront ourselves with different programmatic and site conditions, with different scale conditions, with different conditions of production, et cetera.
Right. Nader will be representing Office DA. Monica could not join us tonight. So looking at your work, I'm struck by the way in which you deal with materials. And you told me recently that early on, in your career, you and Monica were not doing much architecture. You were doing furniture and sort of small craft-based work. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what you learned from that and how that impacted your subsequent architecture.
Well, we did, the way we launched our career really was somehow a critique of our own education, because everything was rooted in abstractions and in typology, in history, but any studies of construction, materiality were somehow absent in the 80s. So in many ways, our practice was launched on a kind of dedicated and focused revisitation of just material qualities, problems of aggregation, and their implicit connections to geometry. The MoMA project, the fabrications project, the folded steel structure, was one of those kinds of experimentations. We thought the MoMA project would not only bring us fame, but many jobs. And nothing happened, of course. And so then we went into that phase that you're describing, is that we said, well, we can't fund our own buildings, but maybe we can fund our own pieces of furniture. So we did start over a 1 or 2 year process, a more systematic set of studies with fiberglass, with carbon fiber, with wood, and steel, taking apart not only the functional requirements of different kinds of pieces of furniture, but their different uses and their different relationships to material. So in many cases, if there is a methodological bias, we will look strategically to how certain projects take certain materials and then try to radicalize their use in a way that we feel has not been taken advantage of prior to our interventions.
There's a wonderful sense in all of your projects, a wonderful sense of craft and nuance and appreciation of materials that I find enlivens your buildings in the most beautiful contemporary way. Back to you, David and Marc, this sense of working with materials and seems to be very important in your studies too. Many of your projects I've looked at strike me almost as installations and real individual pursuits of materials. And
yeah, I think that's true, especially operating as sort of youngish, I guess now, architects in New York City. Inevitably, a lot of the projects that we were confronted with early in our careers were really interiors-based projects, that we were essentially operating within spaces which had highly predefined spatial parameters. In other words, a given building envelope that we were essentially inserting a new program into. What this led to was a kind of initial kind of great deal of frustration, which is that one wasn't necessarily capable of operating with a lot of the tools that an architect traditionally has, which is to say there wasn't a lot of plan manipulation, there wasn't necessarily sectional manipulation vertically that we could operate within because of this kind of envelope condition. And what we realized was that we had to find ways of thinking architecturally about the material surface in many of these instances. I think this is true of the restaurant projects specifically that we showed. And the idea was, rather than to simply specify, select, or apply a material, which is often the approach of architects and designers, could one in fact take, in many cases, very banal, everyday, and kind of commonplace materials, and through the ways in which they were combined, aggregated, and assembled, actually find new potentials within the kinds of things that are often overlooked. And I think, in a way, to flatter probably ourselves, I would say our work shares something with Nader and Monica's work, which is a desire to extract new possibilities out of constructional conditions, out of material conditions, which arguably hasn't been the sort of focus within the kind of architectural discourse over the course of the kind of preceding, let's say, 20 years. Yeah.
I think it's really opened up a lot of exciting possibilities in the whole field of design. What about you, Rick? The impact of new technology and materials, has that influenced some of the materials that you've decided to work with, or has it inspired you to start experimenting with them?
Probably not. I generally work with things that kind of have a traditional set of references. I deal in things that are kind of aged and weathered. So yeah, I'm not that progressive, I think.
All right. Maybe not in the materials, but in the cuts, I would think. Peter, as a leading vision in your field of architecture, landscape, perhaps you can impart to us some wisdom. And I'm wondering what projects may have been your toughest, perhaps at the time, but in retrospect turned out to be the most essential to determining the evolution of your design practice.
Well, the toughest project that we've had isn't done. The memorial has clearly been the most difficult project we've ever undertaken.
The World Trade Center.
Yeah. And I'm not sure how it's going to come out. We're still working at it. We're sort of in the midst of things. But it's complicated in ways that nothing else that we've done has been. When I began, particularly in this last 20 years, I was wandering around French gardens with a group of students from Harvard and Michigan. And it suddenly occurred to me that Lenotre was a very modern fellow. And I know that's not what most historians would say or think, but these Baroque gardens were all made out of these extraordinarily flat surfaces. The modulation, the scale was achieved in a very, very minimal way, even though they were Baroque, they were gigantic, and that's the reason they were Baroque. But the control of them was very much like things that I've been collecting. They were very much like a Judd, very much like an Andre. I mean, they were making the surface important. And up until then, I'd been making mounds and trees and doing picturesque things in Olmstedian fashion. And it suddenly occurred to me that there was another way one could go about it. Not necessarily a new one, because Lenotre had beaten me by 300 or 400 years, but still something which would add to what we were doing. And almost all of our work in the last, 15 years, let's say, has been informed by that one kind of like aha moment, the light bulb goes off. And it was very, very difficult because I was very familiar with the art, but the art was largely inside. It wasn't out there in the rain, it wasn't out there in the sun, it wasn't operating in that milieu very much. And so we had to sort of figure out what was the way that those ideas could be translated and could be moved out of doors. And perhaps even more importantly, how they could work with things that were alive and things where it was raining and where the water was moving through. And at the same time, give off this quality of being just what they were, not a picture of something else, not pictorial in any way, almost the opposite of the Olmstedian tradition. I don't know whether that's wise, but I spent 20 years messing around with it.
Were there any other projects very early in your career that...
Well, we got a chance. We'd done a lot of work with IBM, and we got a chance to go to Japan, which is a country that loves gardens and also knows how to make gardens better than I did, better than anyone I know does. So working with Taniguchi and working with Isosaki, we were able to do a series of projects which really explored these ideas that I'm talking about. The IBM Service Center, which is sort of halfway between Narita and downtown Tokyo, is one of those, which is absolutely dead flat. It's taking all the sort of traditional Japanese materials, but rearranging them in ways that are much more Judd-like, much more just there they are, what do you think? And that was a very important project for us. And I think we've been building on that one ever since.
Nader, a few weeks ago when I was met with you and we were talking about architecture and how architecture has changed, and our young architects are redefining authorship, the way architects work, digitization, working with construction companies has changed radically. And the separate, discrete professions are no longer compartmentalized but well integrated. And perhaps you can tell us how that's affecting architecture as a whole and the way you and Monica work.
Well, there's a range of changes that I think are taking place. Like LTL, we actually have a similar structure, that we work on all projects together through a principle of redundancy, so we share that trait. I think we do more boxing than they do probably, but I'm not sure about that. But it's a very productive process, because it's the idea of collaboration is implicit in what we do. But more broadly speaking, as we started getting real jobs, not the invented jobs that we would conjure up ourselves, and had access to a more vast set of consultants and other disciplines, you begin to realize that there's an incredible range of mechanisms, techniques, and intellectual biases that come from people from outside of your discipline. And so that has very much expanded the way that we think and the way that we strategize certain projects. In many ways, under that model, you become not the sole author of something, you become more of a director, because you're strategizing what an engineer can do for you. They are thinking through a practical problem. They are not thinking through its architectural or spatial potential. And so in a way, you co-opt their discipline to radicalize it in a way that they had never thought it through. The McAllen building is one of those exercises. That building, while it's just a traditional residential building, is composed around a staggered truss system, which lightens the loads of the building, makes it virtually prefabricated off-site, and it gets it built in half the amount of time that it normally would. But it innovates spatially as a result of the predicament of the staggered truss. That's just one example. The other thing that obviously has changed the way we work, this has international implications, I'm sure everybody here is working in one place or another at some point, is the internet, computation, digitization, and so forth. And so a lot of the times you don't design a precise artifact, you design a process. And so in a way you're designing parametrically. You define the limits and the criteria by which something is designed, and other people can engage in the process of the design of that particular artifact or scenario. So you're in the role of a director, and people are interpreting your directorial instructions in different ways. So I think that somewhere between the fact that techniques of construction through digitization, CAD, CAM, and so forth, are changing the way we build, but at the same time, the way we are working.
You mentioned the name of a metal fabricator in Kansas City. I forgot the name.
Zahners.
Zahners.
Yeah.
That, as a matter of fact, we worked with them in St. Louis. I forgot.
That's
yes. But they started as doing these sort of small-scale metal projects, and now are to expand their business, but also their way of working with architects, doing entire cladding, like for the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, and working with a lot of the celebrity architects, designing in ways that they never would have gotten involved in the design process before.
Yeah, I mean, I think folks like that, and there are more emerging out there, is that they're addressing the problem of integration in more sophisticated ways. There are shops here and there that are dealing with processes, CNC routing, laser cutting, and so forth, as a kind of single-dimensional problem. What they did, for instance, I know more closely what they did at MIT with Gary's project, is that they went beyond the skin. They took the problem of panelization integrated it with the waterproofing problem and the mechanical system of the building. So it had structural implications, environmental implications, and fabricational implications. So putting that all together, it suggests that a sheet metal company is not merely just a sheet metal company anymore. All of a sudden, they're bringing different kinds of engineers and different intellectual resources to redefine the way you work. So in our case, often we don't design something. Actually, we will go directly to a contractor, a subcontractor, or a company like that, learn everything about the way they think, and then through their mechanisms, we reconceptualize a project.
Wow, everyone is specialized but really integrated. Must be very exciting for some of those companies that may have seemed like they had a more limited
Actually, I haven't
range.
working with them, but I've working with Milgo Bufkin across the river here, who do some great work. It's just a little shout out for them.
Rick, how do you work? Do you work on the computer at all, or are you? I know you come from a strong background of pattern making.
I changed my mind. Now I want to be an architect. I mean, it's like,
Can't wait to see. You have a wonderful sense of structure in your clothes and
well,
sense of
yeah, nothing
restraint,
compared
which
to these guys. Yeah. I'm sorry. So you were asking me?
No, how do you work? Do you work? Do you sketch? Do you work with computers at all, or is it?
You know,
all
it's
your
so
pen?
organic and it's so. You know, I admire the way these guys think, because in a way I've trained myself not to think so much, because I have to rely so much kind of on instinct, and if I overthink things, it just doesn't come out. So in a way, I kind of have to go in the opposite direction of these guys, and I kind of regret it sometimes. But I actually collate lines in my head over a long period of time in between collections. I always carry an index card in my back pocket, and usually at the gym or traveling, I just come up with shapes, lines on a body. I definitely think very much in 3D. And a lot of times, it's funny, with men, thinking of men's work, it's a lot different for me than women. Women, it's almost more of a physical, affectionate approach, kind of the way you would caress a woman physically. The angles and directions that your hand would travel on the body. With men, it's not quite so sensual. With men, I think men need to project an air of dignity a little bit more than sensuousness. And although they want to look sensual, the last thing in the world they would want anyone to think is that they're trying to. So, I think dignity is more kind of my approach with men, but with women it's definitely a lot more of a physical thing. So then at the end of my 6 months, I kind of collate all of these ideas and I see if there's a collection there, and usually there is. So that's kind of how I work.
Well, whatever you're doing is working. Keep continuing, because when I look at your designs, I kept thinking, boy, this looks like a glove. I mean, a really soft, seductive glove. So, you know, there is a place for the non-precision, and it's nice to, with your clothes, since they're not one specific way of wearing them, or they can be slightly customized. I think that's something that's very appealing to.
Well, yeah, and I think, you know, I'm kind of suggesting that the wearer is smart enough to know what to do with it. So I've always kind of resisted, maybe even disapproved of clothes that kind of had to shove your body around too much. Things that kind of implied that your body wasn't perfect by kind of being too tight somewhere because it was suggesting your bust needed to be somewhere else, or your waist really was a little bit too big for this kind of constricting garment. So I've always been a big believer in things kind of flowing across the body, and you know, letting someone know that you know, you're good enough, and and you can look good without having to be manipulated so much. So that's kind of been my approach.
Okay, I'm going to ask Peter Walker a question, and this may sound a little academic, but I'm going to ask it anyway. There seems to be something called landscape urbanism now. I've heard about it. I really don't know what it is, but we've always had infrastructures and always made landscape. And what is new about this? Or what is it?
I don't know what it is.
Oh, dear.
I read it the first time when you gave me the question. But you also, at the end, you asked whether there's something in the city and then there's something in the country. And I think that one of the trends that we're involved in...
The spaces between.
Yes, the spaces between. But what we're involved in now, more and more, is the spaces on top. Because the city, the roads have gotten so wide, they've simply taken up all the space in the city. They almost run from face of building to face of building. We don't even have plazas anymore. You see them very rarely. So what's happening is that the spaces on top of buildings, on top of garages, sometimes it looks like it's on the ground, but there's building underneath. I mean, for instance, the World Trade Center is on top of a 7-story building with stations and chillers and parking lots and everything down there. Maybe more than 50%, I don't know exactly, probably more than 50% of our work now is on top of a building rather than in front of or beside. And even like, for instance, in New York, if it's in front of and beside, it's on top of a building that you don't see, which is down underneath the streets. Chicago's like that. There's a whole city underneath Chicago, and the things that we've done there are basically on a structure. So that's becoming more and more the trend. One of the things that's interesting, I mean, when we got elevators, people could go up easily. And so now people can come out of the buildings. And a lot of buildings, a lot of architects we're working with will open up the buildings, not just at the ground, but other places. It was interesting, I was up in a client's office in Rockefeller Center, and their office is right on one of these gardens, and you look out and it's just like their floor has this garden extended. It could be suburban almost, rather formal, but still could be out in the country. And that's the way an awful lot of work is going now. We had a project in San Francisco recently, which was on top of a transportation center, about 5 acres on top of this transportation center. And it turned out that you could build a park on top of that cheaper than you could build the glass roof that would cover it. Glass roof would be something like $400 a foot, and the garden would be $200 a foot. So you could have a park instead of a glass roof at half the price. And of course, it was a competition, and we won simply because we had a park on top of there instead of a glass roof. So I don't know whether that's what you mean by urbanism, but that is a trend, very strong trend in our profession.
Well, that's actually fascinating. It makes me think, gosh, the Cooper-Hewitt is renovating. I wonder if we could have a green roof. I know Paul's out there somewhere, but you've been working with green roofs, haven't you, Nader? And you're in the recent McCullen building.
Right. We actually, I mean, we didn't grow up with issues of sustainability front and center in the design curriculum, certainly, but as we emerged in the world of commissions and all of that, it turned out that most of the projects we competed for and or built have a base set of requirements that one could call green. Some of those bars are relatively low. They have to do with, LEED certification. Others have to do with certain innovative strategies that extend way beyond LEED certification. The green roof is a standard, I would say. It's a way of reducing the amount of, or extending, maximizing the amount of greenscape, creating oxygen, and lessening the CO2, But I think it's in the realm of some of the other technological aspects of the building that we have yet to do a lot of research on. And so I would say we're still pretty young and green ourselves in this territory.
But I remember you saying that one shouldn't even strive for that any longer. It should just be the base standard, and then we take it we develop from there.
I mean, yes. I mean, I agree with that. I think that if Office Star is a green architecture firm, it should be a question of policy. I mean, that I think that problems of sustainability are obviously coming to a head through the way that the environment is changing. So yes, at one level, I think that questions of sustainability should be governed and should become policy. But that's not an excuse not to innovate. And so that I would like to raise the bar and say that there are much more interesting ways than what policy will. I mean, think about the way that we climb stairs in the US versus other places. Here we have guards and 4-inch posts and so forth, so that we can't do elegant things in the way that Rem can do them in Holland. But that makes you more of an architect, because you have to overcome those very policies to come up with more innovative solutions. I think in a way sustainability is the same thing. It's everything is implicit or explicitly is composed of rules and regulations. The question is, how can we higher that standard on the one hand and then have much better projects change the way we think about building. And I think the question of integration or difficult synthesis is what could be the next problem. I say difficult synthesis because, with the way that we've been educated about problems of integration is through the ideological lenses of the Pianos and the Fosters, who have a very holistic understanding of design. But what happens to those urban conditions, to those design problems that refuse the kind of autonomous systematicity that they impose on designs? What happens to those exceptional conditions? I'm interested in those things.
Well, before I go on to one of the other panelists, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about BP as a client, because they, I think we were all struck by that wonderful gas station you and Monica designed in Los Angeles. The one that was clad, it doesn't say sustainability to me at all, and so I was really struck by the whole project.
Well, the LA project is thought of as a living laboratory, and I think that's very much the way that the BP conceptualized it. And in being a living laboratory, it doesn't see itself as an end of a certain design research, but actually the beginning of such a thing. And so it's designed as an open apparatus that may change and evolve over time, either on that site or on other sites. They were very much the driving force, obviously, behind that initiative, and I'm not sure if they see every gas station becoming like that, but I certainly think that they are researching different ways of conceptualizing energy, which is why they are not called British Petroleum anymore. They are called Beyond Petroleum.
Didn't know that.
And BP, and I think the image of that project, or the way popular reception may perceive it, is also about rebranding. In other words, I don't think necessarily the triangulated metal facets are not a direct mirror of the problem of sustainability. Yes, it is true that they're stainless steel, and part of the resources come from recycled stainless steel, but they could have been many other forms. Part of that has to do with reimagining what a gas station is, not as a conduit for getting gas, but as a destination. They wanted a new experience. They wanted a new programming of the back structure, a new way of engaging with the public, a place of education. They close the place off from certain times and bring school kids there and talk about broader issues about sustainability. So I think that's really part of an outreach program. It's part of a broader imaging process that they're undertaking. So I think it's a design exercise, really.
Oh, that's fascinating. I have to follow up on that. David and Marc? Are you working much with issues of sustainability in your projects?
Yeah, and I think the point that Nader made is absolutely critical, which is that to practice with a sense of responsibility to the environment is essential. But too often, the way in which sustainability is talked about, and this is one of the questions we have had over issues of a kind of checkoff system, is that it's seen as something that's applied to a project rather than something that is a catalyst for rethinking how a particular project is approached. In other words, rather than saying sustainability as something that you match by appropriate selection of X, Y, and Z, we're much more interested in seeing sustainability as a fundamental reorchestration of the way in which you approach everything from siting, to the way in which the building form is orchestrated, to the way in which materials are brought to the site, to the way in which you understand the role of architecture to construct human habitation. And I think that's a very different approach than a sustainable method that really sort of says what's happening now is fine, but just make a couple slight changes. We're much more interested in sustainability as a source of innovation, as a framework for posing fundamental questions about how we live today and how we're going to live in the future, and essentially catalyzing the things that will make it far more interesting to the design than a series of obligations that you just have to work your way through.
I think part of that has to do with the difficulty of thinking of sustainability simply as a moral obligation on the part of the architect, and clearly it is. In other words, this, we would agree with Nader on this point, that it has to be an assumed part of how one builds today, the same way that one has to assume the building has to stand up, it has to function environmentally, et cetera, et cetera. I think the critical thing here is that I think in the past, sustainability has often been seen as something which, in a way, burdens the architect with yet another responsibility to satisfy. I think for us, the critical thing is not to think simply in terms of what can architecture do to satisfy criterion of sustainability, but in fact, what can sustainability do for architecture? In other words, we actually think that what's exciting to believe is that thinking through issues of sustainability can in fact make better buildings, right? Can make better buildings from an architectural standpoint, can allow buildings to produce innovation in sort of spatial terms and programmatic terms, in terms of the interaction between interior and exterior, in terms of notions of envelope, exterior. So I think what it allows us to do, hopefully, is to begin to kind of question a whole series of pre-existing assumptions and presumptions about what a building is, and give us, in a way, a kind of license to reinvent a lot of criteria and a lot of conditions that heretofore have been sort of assumed through kind of standard, practiced, and repetition. Right. So it's a kind of fantastic opportunity for architects, and I think that's the way it really needs to be seen, right?
And as educators, are you really pushing your students in this direction? Is this, yeah.
No, it's absolutely essential, and it's part of the way in which we frame projects for our students, that it's not something that'd be thought about down the line, that you need to apply this, but rather, how do you structure a project from the beginning that catalyze these issues at a fundamental level within the way in which you think of the role of the building, not only within the site, but within the sense of an urban context, and the question of whether or not you renew, whether or not you transform things, or whether you adapt. And I think it's a much broader way in which you approach pedagogy, which I think goes back to fundamentally the question of the introduction of the primary basis by which material and understandings of materials have to be seen not just as an end product, but part of a much broader process. Both industrial process, but also a broader sense of life and change and age within the buildings. And I think this is something that, as Nader has talked about, is different than the way in which we were educated, but it's something that we feel is absolutely critical as educators to bring to our students, that there is a tactile quality to the material properties that are not to be seen as something that is left off to the end, but actually can be orchestrated within early parts of the design process. It has a legacy, that has a history, and it also has a politics.
Do you think there are a lot more materials out there to be discovered or innovated, invented through this?
I think there is. I mean, they're constantly new materials. Some of them are new because of their processes, others are because of the way they've been milled or reorchestrated. But I think as much as anything, it's approach to materiality that looks very carefully about what has been done and what are the things that are still yet to be tested. through accumulation, through aggregation, through reiteration, that materials, rather than seeing them as this kind of a dead thing that are given to you and you have to apply it, rather than something that's a material that can be manufactured in some sense by and through the process of design. So it's not just a kind of applicator's process, but really an orchestrator's process.
Okay, we have a question here from the audience. Anyone have a question? Oh, several hands. Please, we're here for you, so.
How are you? I have a question about the way you work. Obviously, all of you have very successful practices, but it's more concerned with the things that you don't relegate to maybe an intern or somebody who works for you, things that maybe others assume should be done by an intern, but you handle personally because it lends itself to the design experience or the way you work.
Does someone want to tackle that? Peter?
We're an office that grew out of a school. So we're a teaching office, and the idea in our office is to get as much information out and get people doing as much as they can all the time. You're pushing that in exactly the same way you would push in a studio at the GSD or at Penn or wherever. We take the same view about our clients. It's not so much selling anything, but it's explaining. And a lot of times they won't go with you if they don't understand what it is you're doing or what you're proposing. And that's just like a student, you know, they're not going to buy in if you can't grapple with that and get them engaged in it. So I think that that's the way the office works. Obviously, a lot of us have very strong egos and would like to control. We are control freaks. We'd like to control everything that we can. But even the smallest project is so complicated that that's really impossible. And you're working in not giant teams, teams of 5 and to maybe 8 or 9, 10 on something like the memorial. And everybody's doing everything.
Would you like to answer, Nader?
Sure. I mean, it really has to do with the way that you structure your office. In our case, I suspect it maybe I talked a little bit to you earlier on, but it's a very horizontal organization of our office. So what happens in our case is that we put, whether it's an intern or somebody with 5 years experience or 10 years experience, we put them in charge of the project. And then Monica and I end up being their employees because that's the only way we can continue to be designers. Otherwise, we would end up being managers and sort of business people doing RFQs and going to all of these meetings without any relationship to the work. So strangely, what happens is that we invert that process. We put people with sometimes very little experience into positions of great strain, burden, and responsibility. But by doing that, they learn a lot, and then we still get to play.
Great, I can learn something from you. Anyone else like to comment on that? Rick? Okay, I saw more hands, yes.
All right, question for Rick. Hi, Rick. I was just wondering if in the near future you might consider doing the second line, which has the same design sensibility, but probably more accessible.
I have two.
Sorry, I didn't
no.
do enough homework, but could you elaborate on that?
No, I have one jersey line that's just based on the original jersey draped pieces that I started with, and a denim line. So yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to just follow up a little bit. In regarding of the furniture line that you've been doing, are you considering expanding it a little bit more, or because it's really exclusive?
Actually, I've just started a collaboration with Jousse Gallery in Paris. Philippe Jousse is one of the foremost dealers of 20th century modernist furniture. He's one of the two main dealers in Paris for like Jean Prouvé and Charlotte Perriand and designers of those ilk. And I believe that I'm the first contemporary designer that he's shown He might be running out of Prouvé, I'm not sure, but I'm completely flattered that he's taken me on. So yeah, we'll be distributed a little bit more now.
You'll have to send some designs to us, photos to us. Great.
I was wondering, for everyone on the stage, as some of the world's, please don't take my picture, I'm really weird. Sorry, I don't like having my photo taken. Sorry. So as some of like the world's most innovative designers, I was really excited to come here to see Rick, so I'm so happy you're here in the United States. But I was wondering what each of you find most rewarding about design, and if there are particular problems that you find most interesting when you're designing to solve, or you seek to solve, or certain goals you have that you're really happy when you achieve when you're in your design.
It's a very tough question because each project that we do actually sets up a very different set of criteria and a set of questions. I think the thing that's most rewarding about the process is that you're too busy to actually step back to figure out what's rewarding about it. So in some sense, the continual change, the fact that you walk in one day and you're going to be doing something completely different than you anticipated that you're going to be doing, sets up a way in which you're living that's very different than taking a job. And I think that is something that we've all been very interested in establishing in the office, that it's not just a job, but it's actually something that engages the way in which you see the world, the way in which you approach life. And I think that it's hard then to pinpoint that to a very particular, a specific item or category or object that then is the most desirable within that, because it's more of the way in which you approach a perspective on the world that is fundamental to the way in which you live life. And I think that is a privileged position, absolutely privileged position to be in, and it's something that we relish and at least thoroughly enjoy.
Yes, Rick, I have another question for you, and it is, I'm right here. In your organization in Paris, do you have Americans working with you in your structure, design assistants, interns, office managers, etc.? When you're putting your shows together, I would imagine you use a lot of people from Paris, but do you have Americans? Question?
Not one.
You don't have one?
Yeah. To tell you the truth, language is such a huge barrier, and no, actually we do have a few Americans in the sales force, but it's so fundamental that everyone speaks at least one foreign language that it's usually Europeans that speak French, Italian, English, and something as silly as paperwork. I mean, just the Europeans, you know, they don't have the visa problems that Americans do, and you know, the young Americans do. So it's actually, yeah, mostly Europeans over there. But I was thinking about the other question about the most satisfying part of creating, and I think that it's kind of not the most elegant thing to admit, but I think one of the most satisfying things, and I think anybody who creates would agree with me, that one of the main things that anybody wants is to be listened to. And I think that when you create something and people respond, I think that's fundamentally the most rewarding thing. The end.
As Tim Gunn said yesterday about fashion, it has to be irresistible. You have to really sell it has to be irresistible. Speaking to people and responding, a visceral reaction, very strong visceral reaction.
It becomes, it's an emotional thing. It becomes, yeah, an emotional relationship with somebody. And, but I mean, everyone up here has experienced that, and that's why they're doing what they do, because they've created something that people have responded to. They've listened. So when you have that kind of communication, it's very satisfying.
Congratulations to all of you. I wanted to know how you manage, influence, persuade, manipulate possibly clients who have an idea and want it a certain way, but you know what will work in practicality or design ways or what's best. Because Christian, so how do you do that? Do you enjoy doing it? What tools do you use, or do you hire somebody else to do that for you?
Nader, would you like to start?
Well, I think it's a brilliant question.
Yes, it's a great question.
It's basically all we do all day. Yeah. And we will go to great depths to paint a picture in as many ways as we can possibly ethically do to convince somebody that something should be a certain way. But in that sense, it's a little bit like the legal profession, in that often a lawyer may have to represent somebody that they know has done a crime. And yet they have to make a convincing case about an alibi. So the problem of persuasion and rhetoric is central to painting a picture. And so much of design is not about facts. It's about a vision, or it's about a system that has its own rules and regulations. So you have to get people to buy into that process. One way that we do it, I mean, there's all sorts of hokey things to do, but one way we do it is that we don't design. We design with clients, or we design with contractors. We so much inhabit their territory that by the end of the day, they own the process. Once we know the parameters that they're comfortable with, then we go and design. So that the psychological barrier between the visionary, the artist, is broken down. So we demystify a little bit the problem of the artist. Then, when you come back with something potentially fantastic, and you leave the room, they say, well, actually, I designed that. They're just I got them to draft it up for me, which is great.
Great answer. Peter?
I always tell my students, that they're going to be working with architects. We always talk about having collaboration in school, but when school's over, it's all collaboration. So it doesn't matter what you do in school, that's where you're going to end up. And I always tell them that my most admiring aspect in dealing with the architects that I deal with is that they're stubborn. And they hold an idea sometimes for 5, 6, 7 years and never let up on it. And that's how those marvelous things get done in large part, because they simply, it doesn't mean that they don't elaborate or don't move left or right, but they don't go astray. And I admire that, and I try to do that myself.
Hi. I was just wondering if there was a contemporary in all of your fields where you look at their work and go, oh, damn, I wish I would have come up with that, and how you might take that and channel it into your work, or if you channel it at all. So basically someone in your field that you admire and say, I wish I would have come up with that.
I like these guys, but I wish they would win less competitions and give some of their work to me.
You're basically asking the question, what's on our nightstand, effectively. And I think, I was very interested to hear the relationship to history that you have to have. And I think that's part of what we've always been interested in, is looking not just at contemporary architects. I'm dodging your question, by the way, because what's on my nightstand stays in the bedroom. But that we're equally interested in what's happened by Le Corbusier, by Piano, by Rogers, by OMA, to work that's been done far older than that, to the work of Pompeii and others, and other places, because it's not a kind of local condition that you're looking for the most recent thing, but how is it that other people have approached similar questions, maybe at different times, but raised fundamental questions about how you practice and how you think about architecture.
Rick, do you have an answer for that? Curious. Contemporary hero?
Yeah, a lot. I'm always inspired by other people. I couldn't even single anybody out that I kind of look at what everybody's doing and just cheer them on. And I'm still, you know, I know that I'm stimulated by them, and I use that kind of. There's really very few instances where I say, yeah, no, I do. I do say I wish I'd done that. There are a couple of things. But there's so many that I couldn't even single them out, so.
Well, one thing that's changed a lot, because I do remember when we were students, they will remember this, we would look at Architecture magazine, Record, and so forth, and you would see the stars published. The difference now is that there's such a vast network of information systems through the internet that you're not looking at the stars, you're looking at everybody. So there's students, there's people in Iran, there's people in South Africa, there's people here, there's people there. And often it leads to a kind of democratization of a design idea, so that somebody who's just a student, is doing much better work than the so-called stars. So I don't have all the time in the world to be surfing the web all day, but I get, you know, people send me stuff all the time, and you're floored by the great research that is being done out there. So there's an incredible shift in emphasis right now about quality. Quality is actually everywhere, all the time, in a way that we didn't have access to it or wasn't there 20 years ago.
Question over here.
Hi, congratulations, all of you. This question is for David and Marc. Nader addressed the issue of prefab a little earlier, and from a lot of the pictures that are in the slides a little earlier, it addressed so much about craft and this intensity and labor. I was wondering how you two approach this idea of prefab and how to be efficient in craft and time.
Yeah, I think that this is something that's sort of been evolutionary in our work over a kind of long period of time, and a lot of the projects that you're referring to in a way happened early enough in the kind of process of our careers. I think that purely out of a system of necessity, we ended up not only operating within, one might say, sort of traditional realms of sort of craft and sort of hand fabrication, but in many cases literally building those pieces ourselves. And I think that had to do with the scale of the work. It had to do with, I think, the limitations of the economies of the work. And there were sort of budgets were either low or virtually non-existent in many of these cases. And in other instances, it had to do with how do you actually ask a New York City contractor to insert 120,000 bamboo skewers into a ceiling, which if you actually try to bid out, you get back really interesting sort of information. And so I think that unconventional sort of approaches often require, in terms of design, often require unconventional methods of realization. And I think in that case, some of the conditions that we were trying to achieve within limited means necessitated a certain sort of directness of application. I would say, though, that the line is never that clear, and hopefully what would be true if you looked at any of those projects is that, in fact, in small ways and in incremental ways, they were taking advantage of other technologies. In other words, the patterns for the kind of more complex projects, even though they may have been manually assembled through fairly conventional means, were derived, let's say, as patterns or as operations through digital processes in many instances. In projects that we're pursuing now, I think there has been a kind of transformation in the work where, first of all, we're no longer able to dedicate the hands-on laborious time to produce projects in that way. However, also the change in scale of projects that we're working on necessitates other methods where, in fact, now we have to be able to translate some of those design intentionalities, which are often about complexities of aggregation or sort of patterns of iteration that change over large, say, surfaces, through other means of representation, which, because of the kinds of processes that Nader was referring to earlier, these sort of new means of interfacing with constructional and fabrication processes can now actually move from a kind of drawing process to a fabrication process in a much more immediate way. And so we've been working to some degree with the kinds of intelligence that's out there in these fabrication fields, people like Zainer that have already been mentioned, that are looking at the integration between complex systems of manufacture and sort of architectural systems of assembly. The other sort of aspect of that is, though, I think even as the digital begins to take a certain precedence within the work, we're still sort of trying to operate as much as possible in both realms simultaneously, in the realm of sort of craft and in the realm of these new sort of technological innovations. And maybe to tangentially answer an earlier question that was asked about what we do in the office that one would not anticipate that we might do, I would point to our drawing work, which you're not necessarily seeing here, but one of the things we try to do in our drawings of projects, which are actually one of the fundamental ways in which we explore and develop designs, is that literally the three of us end up drawing into projects through a kind of manipulation and engagement with digital models that are generally produced within our office. So what we're finding is that this generation, the one that constitutes the bulk of our office now, are facile and adept with digital tools that we didn't necessarily have a kind of first-hand training in as students. But at the same time, we're able to interface with those through, say, a kind of more sort of manual process, literally, say, hand drafting, into and over drawings that are produced through the computer. And in that way, I think both finding ways to exploit opportunistically these new sort of technological systems, but at the same time keep this kind of direct engagement of the hand in the work is something that we're interested in, to the point where in fact one can't see where one ends and the other begins.
This will be our last question.
As somebody who's involved with encouraging young people to go into the arts, I'm wondering if you can comment on the education you had as early on as high school, and what were the key either people or influences that would motivate you to continue on your path, which brings you tonight to this awards event?
I'm sure you each have an answer for that.
I had absolutely great teachers. I had really all the way through. There was always someone each year or two, and as I got closer to being a professional, I had absolutely superb teachers. And they've, you know, it's the business of you're paying attention to that. You know, you have to be in touch with that. And I've worked with some of the greatest architects in the world, and I make them into teachers too. I think it's really the people who are willing to take that time and who, I suppose, have deep down inside the enthusiasm which does connect. And I know I've tried to do that to the extent I can. But for me, that's where it was, and that's where it is too.
I think the question is really fundamental, because it goes to when did you get either inspired or open to the possibility of art. I went to a high school in the Midwest in which the art teacher was also I think the offensive coordinator of the football team, and was hired as the art teacher because he understood how to use magic markers. And that's actually not a joke. And most of the people that were taking the class in the high school were interested in the smell of the magic markers. That was great. Luckily I didn't take that class, but what I did have access to was a outside art center of the town that had photography, ceramics, and fine art, an opportunity to essentially make and play outside of the high school structure, and that was absolutely critical. It should have been within the educational structure. It was not, but it was clear that it wasn't going to be gotten there, so I got it elsewhere. Also comes through parents. And that was probably the most immediate, having parents who were involved in academia, but in academia within the arts. And that was probably the most influential and, in my case, unique, which offset the football coach.
Well, I mean, I think maybe building off a point that Peter made a moment ago, I think that we had, certainly I had innumerable teachers in my background that sort of allowed for sort of insights into aspects of art and architecture, which I think probably don't typically exist within the kind of normative kind of scholastic curriculum in the United States, which I think is a kind of incredible sort of deficiency and one that should probably be kind of addressed. Whereas in, I think, other cultures, there is a kind of history of a kind of culture, especially of architectural study, that doesn't tend to exist here because of the lack of a kind of a longer history within our own sort of physical and kind of urban context. But I do think that those sort of instances where one has insight, both through travel, through kind of parental influences, through those sort of key individuals, are the sorts of things that have inspired, I think, all three of the partners within our practice to continue to teach. And I think now one of the things that's kind of fantastic and inspiring is to be in that strange condition of having one foot in practice and one foot within the kind of academic realm, and to continue to draw inspiration actually from, I think, the kinds of fantastic insights that your own students have on a day-to-day basis. And I think, as Nader was pointing out, sometimes the things that are most sort of revealing or surprising or innovative actually come from some of these sort of less expected sources. And so the kind of teaching we see as sort of deeply embedded within the nature of our practice and absolutely sort of integral to the sort of lifeblood, really, of our studio and our work. Right.
Rick, early inspiration?
I don't really remember any great encouragement. I don't really remember any resistance, but I don't know what would have stopped me. So it was just one of those things that kind of had to be. So luckily, I never really had to grapple with those issues, which is very fortunate, I think.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Nader.
It's hard to follow all these personal stories.
Yes.
No, I mean, I have personal stories too. I mean, it has to do with encouragement from family and so forth and so on, and an older cousin who was very special to me. But actually, maybe the decisive moment was the moment where I went to a very prestigious prep school in America, where they could not identify what my forte was. So I did miserably mediocre work in all of my studies until the last year when I rebelled and took art history, design, drama, and a literature course as a kind of sole focus. I had done all of my requirements and realized that this is an arena that I was interested in. And so I got rejected at almost every university except for RISD, so I was very lucky in that sense. But I do think the question that's been brought up about the arts as a way of thinking, as a way of restructuring curricular demands, not in colleges, but rather in elementary school, junior high school, and high school, is the bigger message out there, because there is something that has to do with speculative thinking that is absolutely lacking in the curricular structure of your generic school out there. And if there was a way to change the American education system, that's one of the ways that one would advocate in this kind of forum.
Yes, and I'm very happy to say that the Cooper-Hewitt is actually doing a lot of work with schools across the country, teachers, trying to get design into the curricula across from K through 12. It's a very big part of the Cooper-Hewitt's initiative, and there's a lot online. You can just go onto the museum's website, and you have access to a lot of the programs that we're setting up, and it's a process that we are continuing to develop and redefine. So love to hear from any of you who are involved in that. I would just like to follow on this question about education, because I think it is so interesting, because most of the panelists here are both dedicated practitioners but also educators. And I know, for example, you, Nader, recently left Harvard, have been hired by MIT, and I've heard through the grapevine that they're putting their stakes on you and looking to you to help set the program for the future. So I'd love to hear what maybe your vision is for the maybe helping to change the school. And Peter and David and Mark, if you'd like to follow up, that'd be great.
MIT is a very special place. It has an incredible set of resources at the higher PhD level. They have what's called the 5 pillars in history and theory, in building technologies, in urbanism, in visual arts, and in computation, and probably more sophisticated than any other school out there. What they suffered from was really the lack of a center or a core that brought them all together. So you have a crew of people all in their own cubicles on their computers doing amazing work without any networking or anybody bringing them together. So in great part, my role there right now is to strategize the first 3 semesters, and which goes back to some broader fundamentals that I think everybody here would be involved in other schools. But in my case, the key will be how is it that we are able to tap into the particular resources that MIT has that no other place has, and integrate them back into the fundamentals courses in the first 3 semesters.
The question goes to, at Parsons, where I've been the director of the Masters of Architecture program for 5 years, and recently stepped down to focus only on a design workshop project where students are designing and then building a project. There, the integration of architecture, interior design, and a master's in lighting design is central to the mission of the department. And I think part of one of the great benefits of teaching in New York is that you have so many incredible practitioners that you're able to draw upon from very diverse fields. So the issue that Peter raised before about collaboration is now occurring much more quickly within academic structures between different disciplines that have to come together, not only produce excellence, but also understand the distinctions about where they have absolute knowledge and others don't. So collaboration not as a kind of flattening, but collaboration is in fact an articulation of differences within disciplinary structures. And I think that's one of the things that is, from my standpoint, most interesting about the way an academia is moving is the acknowledgement about differences, but also trying to find shared conditions by which knowledge can be exchanged, but also different bodies of knowledge can be held forth and tested vis-a-vis each other. So.
Maybe this is building off of kind of a similar line of thought, but I mean, I've essentially taught design studios at various sort of institutions for fairly continuously for, let's say, 10 years now. And one of the kind of fascinating things that is happening, as I think it's already been identified on this panel several times, is this increasing and no longer now new trend towards sort of interdisciplinarity and a kind of mutuality among various sort of intelligences surrounding the kind of building profession. And those are increasingly, I think, being integrated into architecture schools and design studios. For instance, I know at Columbia, where I'm teaching currently, there are a series now of sort of satellite, what are called sort of labs within the institution, which really function on a variety of different levels, but looking at issues as diverse as sort of digital imagery, not specifically related to architecture, but say related to sort of larger scale landscape and urban structures, and how those are sort of mapped through representational systems within the computer, to notions of communication, et cetera, and how those impact sort of structures of organization that might be related to architecture. And I think the kind of fascinating interplay there isn't simply, say, a kind of co-option of other sort of disciplinary studies by architecture, but I think a recognition of, I hope, what architecture actually offers intrinsically that might kind of reinform those other disciplines as well. So I don't think it's a kind of simply a kind of dissolution, I would say, of the kind of architectural sort of practice through the infusion of these other sort of influences, but I think simultaneously a kind of recognition of what is it particular about architecture, not in terms of, say, the material conditions of architecture, but I would say more in terms of the logics and sort of processes of thought that are, I think, unique to the discipline in many ways, and how, in fact, can those begin to reform and restructure and, in fact, move out again from the kind of walls of the institution. Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything to add, Peter?
For a number of years, I've thought that one of the great problems that landscape architects, everyone who is trying to bring information in and make something of it, was that it was a sort of a language thing. And I remember reading an article that Robert Oppenheimer had written right after the war in Arts and Architecture, and he said that we were going to go through a period where a great deal of knowledge was going to be gained, but that it was going to be very difficult to move the information from one deep exploration to another one so that you could actually make something of it. And it seems to me that's always been central to architecture and central to landscape architecture, probably more in architecture earlier because landscape didn't have so many things it had to keep track of. But with the environmental change, where we now have scientists and technical people in the same kind of profusion that architecture has, I think one of the most useful courses that we ever taught at Harvard was one which was essentially the languages of these various fields, so that you could gain access and you could lose it, you could find and use information that you otherwise would be separated from because you didn't have that access. And I think that's a process which is kind of never ending, but you have to keep track of it because it's important. It's very much what you were talking about, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a very exciting time to be a designer, I think, today.